welcome to the fourth scheduled roundtable discussion in the series Remapping Justice. The idea is that we bring panelists who can speak for 15-20 minutes each on the topic of interest, and then we open it up to the audience for further discussion. As you know, we're meeting under very difficult circumstances. Most recently, Sabeen Mahmud was murdered, and basically for, it seems, for wanting to participate and invite a discussion. So we will start with a presentation on Sabeen before we start the panel discussion, followed by a minute of silence.
People have stories to tell, how do you find out? And Karachi has been afflicted by violence for as long as we can remember. I think it's critical in any city, but especially a city that faces so much conflict, to have community spaces where people can get together around shared interests. And then the city is huge, where one tiny space in a city of millions of people. I grew up playing cricket on the streets and riding my bicycle and quite the tomboy. Never did girly things. I started working when I was around 15 or 16 at a computer company. I ran that company for about 3 months when I was 17 years old on a summer break, which I think was I would still say is one of the most fulfilling and rewarding, scary, challenging experiences in terms of learning how to run a company. Very naive, but I think NIVET really helps in terms of dealing, with entrepreneurship. I think having some degree of NIVET is fantastic because you are just not aware of fear, and what you don't know is great because you think that you can do anything.
क्या आप अगर मरीज के इलाके में थे तो क्या वो वहाँ पे असल हकीकत क्या हुई मिलिट्री इंसर्जेंसी जो थी क्या हुई, किसको मारा था मिलिट्री ने, हुआ क्या?
मतलब उसमें we had to hide और वहाँ पर उनके हेलीकॉप्टर आते थे इन रोड, ये एक जो नहीं आते थे हेलीकॉप्टर गनशिप थी जो इरानियन पायलट चलाते थे. मतलब it was a full-scale, full-fledged military operation. It wasn't कि मतलब आप कहेंगे platoon strength पर थी या ऐसे आए चक्कर लगाकर चले गए और मतलब everything is fine. So it was terrifying. It still is terrifying in Balochistan. I think it's more terrible today because they can pick up and dump and kill everybody and dump anywhere they like just to frighten the people. इसी वजह से जो कुछ अब हो रहा है intimidation के लिए हो रहा है.
I mean, I think to a great extent, I believe that a lot of most forms of activism are symbolic protests, right? It's an individual's act of resistance, or whether it's moral outrage or whatever, of actually saying, I don't accept this and not in my name. Going and standing outside a church is not going to lead to it's not going to lead to the end of violence against minorities or against, put an end to sectarianism. But it is about getting involved and playing your part in public life.
Welcome to the second session of the Balochistan series at T2F. देखिए बलूचिस्तान मैंने पहले ये कहा जितना कोना रास्ता हमने खो दिया, जितनी तकलीफ हमने सहनी थी हमने सह लिया, इससे ज्यादा हम क्या सहेंगे? मतलब हर घर से एक दो लाशें गिर गई.
But her fight to improve the lives of others may have cost Mahmud her own. This area outside the T2F cafe is now a crime scene. Mahmud had just left the building when she was shot at close range by two gunmen as she got in her car. Mahmud's mother was also injured in the attack and is in a critical condition in hospital. Mahmud has been hosting a talk on human rights in Balochistan, southwestern province where Pakistan's security forces have been fighting separatists, most recently since 2005. 2 weeks ago, a similar talk on Balochistan at the university in Lahore was cancelled over security concerns. And friends say Mahmud had doubts about hosting her event after receiving a threat.
I think what we do is really critical, and I want to continue as long as possible, but it has to be on my terms. I mean, I am a little big-headed about that.
One minute of silence, please, for Sabeen. you. Could the panelists please come up? And then I'll introduce each one just before they talk. Okay, so the first speaker will be Furhan Hussain. He's a Karachi, Islamabad-based human rights activist, digital security trainer, researcher, and communications professional. He currently leads digital security and advocacy initiatives at Bytes for All Pakistan, with a focus on freedom of expression, privacy rights, surveillance, censorship, information controls, and technology-driven gender-based violence. Bytes for All works on free speech and the digital rights debate in Pakistan since 2007 and has been advocating for restoration of internet rights in Pakistan in national and international forums. So he's going to give us an overview of how censorship works in Pakistan.
Can I connect my laptop? My apologies for the slight snag. Before I start to talk about what I'm supposed to be talking about right now, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts about the video which was shared earlier about Sabeen. Having worked with her at T2F and having been, acquaintances and colleagues and friends for a while, her loss was a personal tragedy. It was a very devastating event for myself. And one can't help think about her every time she's mentioned and every time somebody tries to talk about her. And one thing that I often hear is when people say, rest in peace, Sabeen, and about, observing 1 minute silences for Sabeen. And one can't just, help not thinking about how Sabeen would have reacted, perhaps, if she were still around. She would have probably, she wasn't the kind of person who would ever rest in peace. She would have rested in power. Similarly, with 1 minute silences, she would have probably asked for Pink Floyd or the Beatles to be played in her memory, or people just wanting to sing around and having a good time. So, and we'll talk more about her, but the reason why we've all gathered here is to discuss censorship. And how it links to Sabeen is because Sabeen was probably one of the most vocal and frontline activists in Pakistan who worked for their entire lives to promote a very basic fundamental right, which is called freedom of expression, free speech. And when we see censorship happening everywhere, when we see that there are fears all around us about how difficult it is to, say what we feel, it just hurts you even more that it's not just, direct censorship that is happening. It's the worst kind of censorship that we see happening around us, which is silencing of people just because they said something. And words can never really hurt anyone, but people try to penalize others for just saying things as well. Anyway, moving on to what I am going to talk about right now. When asked to put together the story of censorship in Pakistan, I and my colleagues find it incredibly hard because the story of censorship in Pakistan is still in progress. It's in the process of being written, perhaps more ferociously than ever. We all, and many of you are social science students, and I'm sure that you study a number of these aspects of human life and expression. And there is no debating the fact that the purpose of censorship is always to limit free speech and to protect the status quo. The censorship that we see today has turned into a bloodthirsty monster that's ready to attack anybody and everybody. And I don't mind saying that it has spawned largely from the legacy of fragile regimes that have lacked the legitimacy to govern or have acquired political power through fascistic means, if I can use that word. Usually the reason that governments give as to why they censor information is that they say that we're doing it to protect you, really. It's for your own good, which is unfortunate. And it's something that I wish we would question more often. And when we see censorship, when we observe censorship, we see an array of censorship. And this is not, you will not find these terms in any textbook because this is not theoretical, this is more of an observational way of classifying censorship, the way I see it. And there are 4 significant ways that censorship takes place, in my opinion, in Pakistan. So first is the conventional form of censorship, and I'm going to talk about each one of these later. These days we see more creative forms of censorship, and then there are alternate forms of censorship which are not identified as censorship, but they are censorship inducing nevertheless. And then, of course, lethal forms of censorship, about which we have already discussed a little bit. And starting from the more conventional forms of censorship that we see, conventional censorship can be anything from direct attacks on free speech and alternate discourse, alternate narrative, through a large number of weapons, such as censorship of the press, censorship of the internet, replacing facts with fiction, faction, and propaganda in state curriculum, and of course the blasphemy law, about which, of course, it is extremely difficult to talk in this country. Just moving to the previous slide quickly, these snapshots here basically show how the media tends to be extremely censored, and in more recent years we have seen newspapers being published with big white blanks, where the news was just not allowed to pass through, whether through self-censorship of the media or through directives that have come from elsewhere. And this is something that is not recent. We've seen this happening decades ago as well. And of course, in the modern times, freedom of the internet has been largely compromised, especially in Pakistan. Pakistan is one of those, in the world map you can see the countries which are color-coded purple and blue. Pakistan stands as a country which does not have a free internet, no matter what we say, and we will also discuss why that is so. We see that in the past the government has been, and we criticize the government a lot about how incompetent they can be and how bad they are at implementing things that should be done. But when we talk about censorship, we see how successful the government has been in procuring proposals and acquiring really powerful tools for censorship. And we see that NetSweeper is one of those tools which is working in full swing in Pakistan. And not only have they acquired these tools, but have also implemented them, and we see how the government has been very successful in achieving their goal of purifying the internet with their fancy tools. And as a result, we see how the government itself, very proudly claims that over 60,000 websites are blocked on the internet. And they say that, these are pornographic sites and blasphemous sites, and it's to protect you. But it's very interesting to see how websites pertaining to Balochistan are also blocked. Websites pertaining to, blogs tend to be blocked from every now and then. WordPress got blocked a while ago for some time. Facebook has been blocked in the past. Twitter has been blocked in the past. YouTube, which is the biggest library of videos in the world, also is blocked. And under the very similar narrative of blasphemy, pornography, and national security. Moving on, from the conventional means, let's look at the more creative means. And lately we've been seeing how creative forms of censorship are popping up in every corner, all across the internet, which are feared to be supported by both the state and the non-state actors. And there are reasons for fearing this. And one creative form of censorship with a very high potential of causing immediate or eventual physical harm is the use of cyber armies to bully people into becoming quiet. One of the terms that has also been used in the past is astroturfing, which means that you try to twist and turn the narrative, you try to change the narrative by injecting a lot of the word that we use planted, but injecting a lot of people with a similar kind of opinion, or maybe paying them to say the same kind of thing or behave in a certain fashion, so that you can basically change the narrative that you see. And this is more often seen as happening with women. So this particular example is of a journalist who knew Sabeen Mahmud, and at the time of her murder, she could not cope with the trauma, and she had an outburst, and some of it ended up on Twitter. And on her personal timeline, her personal space, no one else was paying for her space, you know. And she received so many death threats and rape threats that she deactivated her Twitter account and Facebook account, and she's still not present online because of the threats that she was receiving. And these are some of the watered down versions which I've shared here of death threats and rape threats that she was receiving. There is a lot more. People were asking for her address. People were sharing the address of where she worked. People were tagging her office Twitter handle where, you know, people were saying that, you know, she should be fired, and, you know, it just goes on from here. And it's just fascinating to see how this has not changed, because 2 years ago, this is exactly what Sabeen faced. And this is just one set of tweets that Sabeen received out of a set of hundreds of tweets and Facebook posts, because of which Sabeen had to withdraw herself from Twitter and Facebook for a very long time. And the threat may have phased away from Sabeen because she is no more, but it still remains for the people who have been associated with her or who have worked with her. And you can see how, you know, they're bringing in religion, they're bringing in personal motivation to, you know, go and attack her themselves and whatnot. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is not exactly censorship, but if you look at what it leads to, it is censorship in essence as well. And while we've discussed many forms of censorship, privacy violations through surveillance often go unnoticed. And when people are surveilled, they become quiet. If some of you have read George Orwell's 1984, which is an amazing novel, a very futuristic, sort of a very visionary novel, which talks about an Orwellian dystopia where everyone is surveilled, everything you say, everything you do is surveilled through technology and human interventions and so on. It really makes me afraid to see how a lot of steps that we are taking us in that direction. And this is not just Pakistan, but this also reflects other countries as well. But we see that Pakistan has been following a certain sort of a behavioral pattern which is directly taking us into that direction. So it turns out that our government seems to be very impressed by that novel. And while I won't talk much about legal surveillance because we have some very amazing lawyers on the panel, I'll just quickly touch upon some of the legal ways that the government surveils upon you. So the PTA itself has some mandate to conduct surveillance, but the PTA has also, you know, given out directives which place roadblocks on using proxies and virtual private networks, which basically, and other forms of encryption, which basically, you know, make your conversations more private, prevent people from reading what you're saying. Then more recently, we had something called the Investigation for Fair Trial Act, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to, you know, take illegal or extra-legal surveillance and throw it into the realm of legalized surveillance, because when things become legalized, it becomes easier for people to question them and it becomes easier to reform them. But what we see is that this particular law asks for absolute secrecy in terms of surveillance. So if you're a user of, say, any cellular network, be it Telenor or Mobilink or, you know, whatever, the authorities can actually go and ask them for your information, your cellular call logs, your SMS logs, and all kinds of data that flows between your mobile phone and the cell phone tower and the other person's mobile phone with which you are trying to communicate. And the problem with this law is that it says that if anyone tries to alert the person who is being surveilled, they will themselves face a big penalty which could include a jail sentence and a lot of financial penalty involved. And of course, a more draconian proposed Pakistan electronic crimes bill at the moment, about which I believe Waqqas is going to talk about in more detail. So I won't touch that. And of course, Naris is a notorious technology that the government acquired a couple of years ago. And while the official narrative was that this was to control voice over internet, illegal VoIP, NSA also uses this technology to surveil upon citizens, and it's very, very invasive. Extra-legal surveillance is also something that I want to talk about, but I can't, and I won't. But it takes place through various means, and it also has to do with a lot of, people or groups who cannot be named. But I want to talk about some specific things that happen in extra-legal surveillance, and wiretapping is one of them. And a lot of women parliamentarians have actually complained about how all of their phone calls are tapped without being given a reason for why they're being tapped or listened into. And they've also complained that they've received phone calls referring to their conversations which they had in private, phone calls blackmailing them and coercing them into, saying certain things or not saying certain things, or voting in favor or against the favor of certain laws and bills. So this is the kind of, misuse that can happen when you see extra-legal surveillance or surveillance that cannot be questioned. And of course, I talked about cellular communications being monitored and everything. And then there's corporate surveillance, where corporate organizations and cellular companies can also be involved in reading into people's information. And then, of course, ambiguous ambit surveillance, which is surveillance technologies that have been found in the country that are extremely invasive. They can read into your personal emails, into your Twitter and Facebook accounts, also all of your social media. They can remotely turn on your webcam without you knowing. So basically, you're under surveillance all the time. And the extent is so much that we can have a separate discussion on that. But we know that this is now happening in Pakistan because there's ample proof available, academic evidence. And of course, under the counter-terrorism narrative, which is something that I'm sure Waqqas and other panelists would also like to talk about, is how a lot of new laws are being implemented which have nothing to do with terrorism, yet they are being implemented under the counter-terrorism narrative, the National Action Plan. And these include, things like the earlier mentioned proposed Pakistan Electronic Crimes Bill, a PEMRA ordinance that was being passed earlier, and various other legal measures that are now being put into place. And none of them have anything to do with dealing with terrorism. And we can discuss why that is in the questions and answers session. Some of the projects that are being implemented under the same narrative includes a very, very invasive Safe City project. Some very invasive biometric databases are being put into place. Discussions about surveillance drones, basically regular drones that can fly around and watch people from a distance, people minding their own business. Corporate surveillance, which is also going out of hand in terms of marketing intelligence and data retention. There is very little discussion about the ethics of all of that. And of course, international collaborations. So at one end, Pakistani government has openly complained against the NSA, National Security Agency of USA, surveillance into Pakistani systems and communications. But at the other end, no one talks about how the Edward Snowden leaked documents have revealed that Pakistan is a third-party partner in the NSA or the Five Eyes surveillance that we also talk about. And of course, Facebook collaborating with the government, where the government sends a request. I'm curious to know about this particular person's details, so Facebook would send them all the data from your Facebook Messenger or your timeline or your anything and everything basically that you share with Facebook can be basically shared, can go back to the government now. So these are a couple of things, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are some of the things that we know. And I personally think that this is probably one of the biggest and the most invasive form of censorship that we see. And this is a infographic that we made about how invasive FinFisher actually is. Wherever you go, whatever you do, FinFisher has the ability to break into your online communications. And currently what we've been doing is that we have personally, as an organization, been challenging these FinFisher and the censorship of websites that takes place in the Lahore High Court. But it's unfortunate that we haven't made a lot of headway in terms of surveillance. And of course, lastly, the array ends at the most lethal form of censorship, which is the silencing of people. And this is something that perhaps I don't have the courage to talk about more because it affects me personally in so many ways. But this is what it all leads to. And I think it's about time that we think about how threatened we all are, each one of us really, because even silencing yourself and not talking about something will not make whoever it is stop and let you remain protected. So I'd like to end here and mic over to.
The next speaker will be Aftab. His organization is International Media Support, and his research contributions include a course on media laws for Afghan universities, a manual on investigative journalism. He writes on issues pertaining to media freedom, right to information, internet rights, and so on. And currently he's associated with International Media Support, an NGO working for capacity development of media and enabling media environment. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very detailed introduction. I will humbly submit that I'm a student of law and public policy, and I will try to learn through this conversation, and I would like to add more into my knowledge base related to my areas of interest. I would like to start from the picture which my friend Furhan has shown to you. And I would like to begin with this statement that since 2000 and onwards till today, the overall environment in this country relating to the freedoms, or particularly media freedoms or freedom of expression, it has seen a very dramatic change. From the industry perspective and the market perspective, we have seen that from one television, state-owned television, to we have now more than 80 private satellite television channels. From one Radio Pakistan to now we are having more than 150 private FM radio stations operating throughout the country. And in 2002, we were having only 150,000 internet users. And at the moment, according to some estimates, more than 30 million connections are working in Pakistan for internet. And if we calculate some more figures, for each connection there must be more than 3 to 4 users. So the number of internet users has gone beyond 60 million. So in terms of numbers in the industry, we have seen a mushroom growth, a huge expansion. But on the other hand, what I have personally seen and what we have observed and what the statistics show to us, that the environment, the freedom has shrunk, and it is gradually and slowly shrinking. There might be many reasons. People who were in their teen, like me, or even older than me, in 1980s, they must have some idea about how government was curbing and how government was controlling the media freedoms and freedom of expression in the country. And the situation today, if I am not wrong in trying to explain, is becoming worse than even that time. That was the time when people were put behind the bars. That was the time when people were tortured. They received lashes. The government tortured them wherever and whatever they want to do. They were put in the Shahi Khilaf. The journalists, they were also put behind the bars. But there is a very little number of people who were killed during that time while they were expressing their views on even security issues or even critical issues or even very serious controversial issues. This is the time when people are not even being sent to the jails, not even being touched and intimidated, but they are killed. And as Furhan has said, this is the worst form of censorship. The fear of death and the death that actually makes you keep silent. And at this point of time, as a person, as an activist who works on freedom of expression, I personally feel that it's the time when I feel suffocation. I want to say, but I have a fear that if I will say something, I might be the next target. Now the question is that why these people were murdered and why these people are here in this picture. To my understanding, they didn't commit anything wrong for their personal good. They were not in pursuit of some personal thing. They were doing some larger good. They were trying to serve larger public. And they were the ones who were voices of people. They were trying to raise their voices. They were the ones who were trying to inform people. And they were the ones who wanted to raise critical voices and wanted to raise criticism against the policies, against the processes, and against the procedures. But as a result of that, they were eliminated. And now we are having pictures. And this raises a serious question that whether a criticism is such a bad thing that if you do something or do write something or you criticize someone, you will be killed, you will be murdered. Is the criticism against the law? Is the criticism against the policy? Or it is something that falls into the definition of hate speech? And I have tried to explain this using this PPP model, which is policy, process, and practice. The policy is explained in this country through Article 19 of the Constitution of Pakistan. That explains the parameters of freedom of expression and the limits on the freedom of expression. Now the lawyer is here and Waqqas will be bailing me out if I'm going to say something wrong. That the freedom of expression clause says that every citizen shall have a right to free speech, and there shall be freedom of press. And this is an enabling clause. And it says that every citizen shall have a right to free speech. Everyone can say anything. Then there comes, subject to reasonable restrictions imposed by the law in the glory of Islam and so on and so forth. Now, if we read through this policy statement, which is the written policy of the state for freedom of expression, it says that you can say anything, you can criticize anyone, you can speak against anything. There is no limit and there is no problem for that matter. However, if you will cross certain limits which are reasonable and which are imposed by law, then law will come into action. and law will take its own course, and then law will give you punishments if you have crossed those limits. No individual will be having the authority to take law into hands and to impose those restrictions. This is the stated policy. And then we have abundance of laws which are relating to these reasonable restrictions, starting from the defamation law, the National Security Act, the Anti-National Activities Act 1974, and so on and so forth. There is an abundance of laws, and none of these laws actually say that go and kill that person who has crossed that limit. Every law, good or bad, irrespective of the fact, whether it is pro-citizens, whether it is pro-freedom of expression, whether it is against freedom of expression, it provides a process. And following that process, that person can be tried, and then he can be convicted or freed. Nevertheless, in our case, what happens is that the policy, the stated policy is not being followed. The laws are not being followed, and if they are followed, they are used or they are enforced selectively. In certain cases, not everywhere. The basic premise is that the law should be enforced equally, and there shouldn't be any sort of pick and choose while enforcing these laws. But in our case, what happens that if something is being said against certain institutions, law takes its course not on its own, but on the direction of certain organization, certain department, certain body, and then the selective enforcement being implemented. As a result of that, the media houses are stopped from saying something, their licenses are cancelled, they are fined, and in other cases, if something is said against certain religious segment, certain religious group, or certain religious individual, the problem arises from the religious fraternity, and then the issue of blasphemy comes out, and the same selective enforcement of that law comes out, and the people who might be in a situation that they are being implicated, the selective enforcement of law will take its course. Now there's a serious issue whether, as I have already said, criticism. The media are these people, are people like you and me. We are criticizing something. If our criticism is relating to certain institutions, as I said, the national security paradigm comes into action. And if this criticism is linked with the religious stuff, the blasphemy and other religious stuff comes into action. So these punitive actions are actually resulting in a severe kind of censorship. And this criticism at the moment is being treated as hate speech, which is altogether different thing. Criticism is something that is within the bounds of law. Criticism is something which is within the parameters of freedom of expression, Article 19. The hate speech falls under the restrictions which are subject to reasonable restrictions imposed by law. And if someone does some hate speech, another law will come into action. However, in our case, we have mixed both the criticism and the hate speech together. And if someone is criticizing, hate speech issue will come up, and the person will be either targeted like this, or maybe some other action will come up. As a result of this, what is happening now is that mainstream media, they have, after receiving a lot of serious threats, problems, and intimidation, they have decided now, it appears, that they have decided to submit. And they will no more be criticizing any of these institutions. For example, we have this example of Geo. What happened with Hussain Mir on 19th of April last year. After that, there was a smear campaign against Geo, and then at some point of time, Geo was even put off air, and they were fined for 10 million rupees, and they paid for that. And once they're back, and once Hussain Mir was back, since this January 2015 onwards till today, what they are doing is that every second day, or maybe on continuously, if you just observe that, on the front page of their English daily, the news, you will see a picture of either army chief or a picture of any other military officer, or a picture having a meeting covering, military officers are sitting, or army chief is doing something. No other picture is appearing since January 2015 till today. Every day, the military is on the front page of that daily news paper. Express Tribune, on the other hand, after having attack on their media house in Karachi, and they have seen a couple of their people, they were killed in that attack, they have also submitted, and now they are doing whatever is possible in self-censoring this content. And the picture which Furhan has shown here, the New York Times, it was actually part of Tribune's daily newspaper, and according to the editor of the Tribune, they themselves decided to put off that column or that piece from the paper so that it may not result in any sort of problem in the society, and as a result of that, the backlash should not come to the paper. So having said that, I would say that the situation from 2002 or maybe from 2002 onwards has gradually worsened for freedom of expression in this country. Particularly after Hussain Mir's assassination attempt. He has survived luckily. He is perhaps the only one among these who is surviving. The rest of these are not. And one of my friends who is also here, Rashid Rahman, today is his first death anniversary. And it's also very sad to mention here that he was the one who believed in the process. He was the one who tried to provide justice to the victims who wanted to, or the people who wanted to say their views, but then they were targeted under this blasphemy law. And he tried to provide them relief, or tried to be help for them through the process. But even he was silenced, and he was murdered in his office on this 7th of May last year. So I will conclude here that the policy, which is stated policy, is that every citizen shall have a freedom of speech. That makes the state responsible to protect this right of every individual. And to protect this individual's right, state has a course, a law, a legal framework, which the state has to take in order to ensure that citizens' right is protected. However, it appears the state has failed to ensure protection of citizens' rights, and state has failed to comply with the policy of protecting citizens, and as a result thereof, state doesn't seem to be visible. The non-state actors and the institutions or the bodies or the agencies which are not responsible for this kind of thing, they have taken their own action, and they are limiting our freedom of expression and our right to free speech. So I would put this question to this august house, that what should this state do to bring our right to free speech back to us? And how can the media in general, in total, help bring this freedom of expression back to the citizens? And what should we, the citizens, do in order to bring our right back? Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Waqqas Mir. He's a partner at Wilson, Taib Ali & Company, which is in their Lahore office. His practice focuses on civil, corporate, and constitutional law litigation. He has also taught here at LUMS previously, so some of you may know him. And he writes a weekly column for the news also.
Okay, good evening and hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. So I'll give you a quick roadmap of what I'll talk about, and my understanding I have about 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah, 15 to 20 minutes. And then we can have questions. So the subject of speech is of course close to everyone's heart, and I'm glad we have that photograph at the beginning of showcasing those courageous people who laid down their lives for this cause. But I think it's very important to remember that each one of them was involved in a different kind of incident. And so when you talk about speech and censorship in Pakistan, it's important to keep that nuanced view when you talk about abuse of power by the state, and then you also talk about action by one-off extremists like Bali, and then you also talk about non-state actors who are organized enough to kill people. And another thing I want to say at the beginning, just to politely disagree with what Furhan said. He said that words can never really hurt anyone. But we're talking about free speech, and words are precisely the kind of thing that will bring down governments, that will elect politicians, that will make politicians popular or unpopular. So words are precisely the thing that will hurt people, individuals, collections of people, and governments. And that is why freedom of speech is such an important right. That is why people fight hard to maintain that right, and that is why governments try so hard to make sure that you cannot assert that right. So I disagree politely with the statement that words can never really hurt anyone. Okay, so the roadmap here is that, everybody claims to love freedom of speech, everyone claims to be for it, but whoever you talk to will then throw in a but. I am for freedom of speech, but I'm not for child pornography. I'm not for women showing videos of them crushing cats with a heel. I'm not for allowing videos of dogs fighting. I'm not for a Sunni cleric saying Shia should be killed. I'm not for child pornography, right? So the but comes in. Throughout the world, this is one of the most difficult debates. So to say that freedom of speech is really precious is true, but it's only true to that extent. That is where the agreement stops. The disagreement begins immediately. Where do you draw that line? Should blasphemy be allowed? Should burning the flag of Pakistan be allowed? Should a Baloch be allowed to come here and criticize the Pak Army, the ISI, so on and so forth? So that's where the disagreement begins. So it's a deeply contentious topic. And whenever you talk about it, you should remember that. You should never say that it's a precious right and that's the end of the story. People are going to be fighting hard for it. Right. So the but comes in. The young doctor's case is a classic example. When I came back from the US to Pakistan in 2012, the young doctors in Lahore were protesting that they weren't being paid enough, and so they had blocked different roads. And even my parents said, well, we are for free speech, but young doctors should not be blocking roads. They should be treating their patients. Right? And you can do a poll in this room, and I guarantee that you will not have unanimous outcomes. Should young doctors be on the streets while ignoring their patients? And people said, well, they should have freedom of speech, but they should not have the right to make the lives of others uncomfortable. But that is what precisely the freedom of speech is. You will not listen to anybody's speech until and unless that person can make you deeply uncomfortable. Right? Until and unless that person blocks Mall Road and gets in your face, freedom of speech means literally nothing. Right? And that's just one example. Okay. So history tells us about, if you look at freedom of speech, that ideas are power. And remember that freedom of speech and its control is deeply linked, inextricably linked to the control of technology. Right? If We did not live in a world where we had the power to disseminate ideas at great speed. I assure you the government of any country, including this one, would not be interested in checking speech. Because if you look at the Romans and the Greeks, what they did was the government co-opted the good speakers because they're the only one who could, gather people, the good orators. And then when the printing press came along, the government realized we have a problem. We need to control the printing press. Then you have the telegraph. The government started controlling the telegraph. And that was far easier for the government to control because you only had the telegraph operator to drive. So if you were trying to send a seditious message across, he only had to whisper something to the government official, that person X, Y, and Z is trying to say this. And now, then came the internet, right? And that's where things tilted, because now everybody became a broadcasting station. And that's where things became really difficult for the government, right? So technology has this deep link with the debate on free speech. So whenever we try and understand why is the government doing this, they're not trying to control people, they're trying to control ideas, right? So censorship through law occurs, but one of the points that I want to talk about in my presentation is how censorship also occurs through private actions. Right? Censorship also occurs by falling in line with conventional wisdom. Like, I'm not expected to say the F word in this room, right? So you will not say it. And there have been cases in the US Supreme Court where somebody said F the draft during the Vietnam War and the lawyers couldn't use the F word in the courtroom. That was censorship too, right? So there are different levels of censorship that the state imposes on us, that we impose on ourselves, and then that we impose on others. So it's important to keep that, and we'll talk shortly about that. Right? And then at the end, we'll talk about privacy before and during the digital age. And at the end, we'll try and come up with a way forward. So let's talk about free speech as a fundamental right and what does Article 19 of the Constitution says. Mr. Aftab has referred to it. So it says every citizen shall have the right to freedom of speech, and then it talks about those exceptions which he's already talking about, right? So are there any lawyers here? Nobody made that mistake. So you have the right to freedom of expression, right? So the word the occurring in a legal document to a lawyer means that it's not creating a new right, it's talking about a pre-existing right? Otherwise the Constitution would have said everyone shall have a right to freedom of expression, right? So when it uses the word the freedom of expression, it means the freedom already exists and the Constitution is already putting it down on paper. So this is your argument against the government that it's not you giving me that right. I already have that right, and when you chose to write down this in a sacred document, you were saying, yes, I recognize that right. And then you try and put limitations on it. So reasonable restrictions of all sorts, glory of Islam, integrity, security, defense of Pakistan, any part thereof, friendly relations with foreign states, contempt of court, so on and so forth. So the natural question is, what does reasonable restrictions mean? Okay? Well, that should be the obvious question. So the Supreme Court of Pakistan had an answer to this question in a case involving the late Mr. Maududi, right? He was trying to form a political party called Jamaat-e-Islami. The government said nothing doing. Ayub Khan was in power. He said, I don't like Islamist politics. Mr. Maududi went to the Supreme Court and cited Article 19, right? And the Supreme Court said something really positive. They said that what reasonable restrictions mean basically means that not only the grounds of restrictions imposed by the law are reasonable in themselves, but they are also applied reasonably, right? And the Supreme Court said you also have to give that person a fair hearing, right? That does not happen often. So when your YouTube is blocked, you're not given a personal hearing, right? So then the question is, okay, we have a right that sounds good. We have the Supreme Court that in 1964 said something that sounds very positive. Then where does the problem lie? Because the law seems to be fairly okay. And my answer to you as a lawyer is that the problem is not just legal. In fact, the problem is not legal at all. So you should not hire people like me and pay me, good sums of money to try these cases in court, because that's not going to solve the problem. The problem lies with the discourse in Pakistan and the politics that we have. So you can view dissent in either a superficial way or have a nuanced view, right? So there are different levels of censorship that I'm not now going to be talking about. Okay, so the state does it as well as society, as I've already said. And we've already seen examples. So if you're on Twitter and you're saying something against Islam, 1,000 people will jump at you, right? And that's not state censorship. Those people may not even have been planted by the state. Those just might be private citizens of Pakistan because they passionately believe that they have a right to say whatever they want to say and shut you up. Another way of looking at it is that they're exercising their right of free speech in a classically good way. right? The American approach to free speech is, even to hate speech, is that you never ban any kind of speech, you allow more speech and that speech gets drowned out, right? So that's another way of looking at it. Now, here's the first kind of censorship that occurs. There is a particular kind of speech that is punished by the state, right? So it's punishable speech. That falls under blasphemy law, laws that target Ahmadis. But the problem doesn't stop here, because if you talk about a blasphemy law as the root of Pakistan's free speech problem, and I'll be submitting to you at the end how we do not have a free speech problem, but we have a rule of law problem. But if you say we have a free speech problem and blasphemy law is the root of it, then you might be surprised to know that Poland, Belgium, and a number of states in the United States have similar laws, right? But they do not have such a problem. Why is that? And the answer is, again, culture and public discourse. And another answer, of course, is the lack of vigilante violence. People simply do not stand up and start killing in the name of religion. The other kind of censorship that occurs is the abuse of law and state authority. Right? So it ranges from harassment to violence. Sometimes a knock on the door will do the trick. You're talking about X, Y, and Z subject, about Balochistan, about missing persons, so on and so forth. Do not do it. Some people will listen, some people will not. Right? No law allows that to happen, that phone call or that knock on the door, right? But sometimes it will take care of the problem for the state. So that's not official censorship, that's extra legal censorship, and you will choose to censor yourself. You will stop saying that kind of stuff. Then there is speech that is gagged by the state, right? So this is the third level of censorship, where the state is not punishing you for something, but it is only trying to tell you, well, if you try and say this, we will block it, right? So first off, you have the press registration law. So the remarkable thing is you cannot publish a book in this country or publish a newspaper until and unless you first tell the government that I'm setting up business here, right? And if you consider the level of anonymity in freedom movements, for example, if you look at the Federalist Papers in the United States which were published anonymously, you realize how big a power that is. I mean, you're literally ceding all power to the government if you tell them at 102C1, I have my printing press. As soon as you say something negative of the government, they will shut you down. So the government takes away anonymity, so that is allowing them to gag you. Then there's PIMRA Code of Conduct, laws in the pipeline regarding hate speech work, which I'll say more later. And then there's the YouTube ban. The government is not punishing you for trying to access YouTube. You type in youtube.com, the government says, sorry, this is simply not accessible, right? Now the YouTube ban is interesting to me as a lawyer because the government is not punishing expression when it's banning YouTube, right? Ordinarily, if you look at the Penal Code of Pakistan, it says saying something or writing something that is blasphemous is punishable. But if you wanted to watch the video Innocence of Muslims, I think it's called, you're not publishing anything unless you choose to share it, right? So there's a free expression right that is also being blocked. So as soon if the government ever tells you that we're using Article 19 of the Constitution, Glory of Islam, to block your access to YouTube, that is a horribly bad legal argument. You trying to watch something is not you expressing yourself. That's like you going into a bookstore, browsing through a book, and saying, okay, this is what it says, I choose not to buy it and put it back. Right? So that is not expression. Expression comes later if you say, well, I've read this book and I'm going to talk about it. Okay? So that's important to remember. But YouTube blasphemy ban is a lot like pornography. Because the government is saying even you viewing it is prohibited. Right? And viewing pornography is punishable under Pakistani ordinary law. But viewing blasphemy is not punishable in the penal code. Right? So if somebody hangs a blasphemous poster out right outside lounge on one of those 4 high boards, you cannot be punished if you looked at it. Right? But if you started wearing a t-shirt with pornographic material in it, then somebody would be expected to report you, and if you started enjoying a pornographic t-shirt, then you would be in trouble, right? So that's the thing. Blasphemy on the internet is a lot like pornography. And the argument that I am trying to develop as a lawyer and discussing it with other lawyers and other people in the society, does this make sense? Is blasphemy exactly like pornography? Furhan made the argument that, states always say that pornography, we're blocking pornography because it's bad for you, but whereas it's freedom of expression. And when I was in graduate school, in law school in the US, 2 of my professors went to debate over it, both women. One of them thought pornography should be banned because it is the sexualization of violence, and no woman can ever participate in that kind of violence. And she actually wrote laws for her, state in Canada banning pornographic websites. And the other said, no, women and men featuring in pornographic videos are actually enjoying themselves, so this is freedom of expression as well. Right? But the state of Pakistan is actually using the first argument, that somehow blasphemy, viewing blasphemy is some kind of violence, right? Just like Catherine McKinnon's argument that pornography is sexualization of violence. Right? And then you have the final level of censorship, which is vigilante violence, right? And then persecution in social media. And so if you're persecuted in social media and somebody comes to your house and kills you, or there have been multiple number of disturbing incidents where people have lost their lives, the state is often too weak to stop that, right? So now we have at least 4 to 5 levels of censorship in Pakistan. To say that it's all being done by the state is patently not true, right? We aid it, private actors aid it, and sometimes the state is just too weak to protect it, right? Okay, so then let's talk about privacy and dissent, because I think they also have a very close relationship. So we were a colonial state. We inherited the telegraph laws that the British made, and the Telegraph Act 1885 of Pakistan allows the government to intercept any kind of telegraphic communication as well. So snooping and wiretapping was actually built into our laws by the British. Right? Now then, in 1973, we had a constitutional right to privacy, Article 14, if any of you want to read it. And that was a pretty big deal. For a post-colonial state to expressly adopt a constitutional right to privacy was a big deal. This was 1973. Just a year earlier, in the year 1972, England's top court had said that the United Kingdom does not recognize a constitutional right to privacy. They, of course, do not have a written constitution, but they have said that if the police is wiretapping your phone, that is perfectly fine, you have no cause of action. Right? So for an underdeveloped state like Pakistan, it was a big deal. It was something to be proud of. But then you also have the Telecom Act 1996, and as a lawyer, it baffles me, has baffled me for a number of months now, that we have all this activism about Fair Trial Act, which I'll talk about shortly, and the new Cybercrime Legislation Act. Nobody talks about Telecom Act 1996. And here's what it said. Notwithstanding anything contained in any law for the time being enforced, in the interest of national security or in the apprehension of any offense, so this is a very broad term, national security could mean anything, or in the apprehension of any offense, not just blasphemy, not just, treason, any offense, the federal government may authorize any person or persons to intercept calls and messages or to trace calls through any telecommunication system. This has been on the statute books, on the law books since 1996. How many times have you heard anybody in Pakistan talking about this? Right? So the activism about free speech is a bit misguided. Okay, so if we are going to be talking about free speech and say, yes, we love free speech and we want Pakistan to develop, we also need to be a bit tough on ourselves. We've overlooked these things, these powers have been exercised all along. This does not require any notice to be given to that particular citizen, but very few people have actually been talking about it. Okay? And then you have the Benazir Bhutto's case in 1998. Her government falls on 5th November 1996. I don't know how many people in this room, remember that time, but if you look at it now it was a huge moment. That is Benazir Bhutto's second elected term in office. Her government is thrown out on 5th November 1996. She's later killed, and she never again will become the Prime Minister of Pakistan. She tries to go to the Supreme Court and tries to tell them my government was removed illegally, and the Supreme Court gives 3 major reasons for throwing out her government. One was corruption. The second was the law and order situation in Karachi. Can anybody guess the third reason? Invasion of privacy. The Supreme Court was actually given material which said that the government has been tapping phones of judges and of other senior bureaucrats, right? And if you read that judgment, and I suggest you read the judgment, it's highly interesting because they also reveal the call signs that the Intelligence Bureau had for the different people. So the Chief Justice of Pakistan was called Blind Man 1. Okay? And that's actually written in the judgment. Some official in the IB thought, well, Justice is blind, Chief Justice, Blind Man 1. Yes. So he made that connection, right? So it's a fascinating judgment to read, but also equally disturbing, and yet what it's doing is a fundamentally good thing. It's saying that a government can be dismissed if it violates the right to privacy. So privacy 1, democracy lost, Benazir Bhutto never comes to power again. Is it a good outcome? I think we're still, the jury's out on that one. And if you want to say, yay, privacy won, well, I would say not really, because a few months later, Nawaz Sharif is in power. He brings out something called the Anti-Terrorism Act, which then goes to the Supreme Court in 1998 in a famous case called the Meramali case, and the Supreme Court is told, well, the police now have the power to barge into our homes and take away, our property if they suspect it's being used for terrorism. And the Supreme Court says, yes, privacy is important, but not so much when terrorism is involved. Okay? So things begin to shift immediately as far as when the state feels threatened. Okay, and then there's the whole element of privacy and responsibility when we're talking about dissent. So are people posting on social media, is that public or private? I mean, that's a question that I think is a difficult question to answer, so I don't expect an immediate answer. Some people just say, oh, it's public, and some people say, no, it's essentially private. So for Facebook, you can probably make a good case that it's not entirely public because your data can only be seen by people who are your friends. Twitter is more difficult unless you put on that block thing. I don't know how that is turned on. But I mean, whatever you're saying is accessible to the general public, right? And you're doing that. You're joining Twitter to say things to the world. So don't turn around and tell me, well, what I'm saying was entirely private. You signed on to Twitter because you wanted to be a broadcast station. You are on Instagram because you want to be seen, right? So when we say that Facebook is evil because it's giving information to people, the immediate reaction is, yes, Facebook does cross the line sometimes. And I agree with that, it does cross the line. But I'll give you another example. When I was in the US and my wife was here with me and it was at her school, Boston University medical student had this fetish that he would talk to women offering sex for money on Craigslist, it's a service, and he would invite them to hotel rooms and he would kill them. This was a Boston University med school student. Right? He killed about 5 or 6 women and then he just vanished off the face of the earth. The police started looking for him, they couldn't find him for about 6 or 7 months, they couldn't find him. How they eventually traced him was by actually writing to Facebook to surveil his activity. And then his girlfriend actually liked somebody's page. And then they started looking for the girlfriend's address, and then they found the girlfriend and found the Boston University medical school. Now, if I tell you that story that happened, would you say that was justice or injustice? What do you care more about, invasion of privacy or catching the killer of 5 or 6 innocent women? I don't have an immediate answer to that, but a number of people would say, I care more about a killer being caught, right? So when you talk about dissent and you talk about invasion and free speech and privacy, it's important to ask yourself, are we interested in privacy primarily as a value for the sake of itself? Or are we only interested in privacy when we fear that our privacy will be abused, right? So a corporation can be causing the greatest amount of pollution, right? And when you hack into its system and take out its data, you are technically invading its privacy. But nobody has a problem with that. Everybody says, yeah, go justice, go green movement, right? So privacy by itself cannot be the paramount value, is never the paramount value for anybody. And when you ask yourself difficult questions, do I place privacy on a high pedestal, you will begin to realize, no, you actually do not place the privacy at the highest pedestal. Okay? That's just not my view. I mean, I'm not going to share my views on this. This is just, general discourse. Okay, then there's the issue of responsibility, which I was talking about. Salman Taseer's death and other similar violent incidents. Salman Taseer's death and Junaid Jamshed's persecution tells us one thing. That when people see blasphemy somewhere or see somebody accused of blasphemy, they get very excited. Oh, I must post about this. I must send out this Twitter post. #blasphemy, And then it kind of generates this viral movement. And that person who may or may not have said something actually becomes the target. Even if you thought Junaid Jamshed was innocent and you put out a Facebook post saying, poor Junaid Jamshed, look at him. That was actually adding to the traffic. That was actually hurting Junaid Jamshed. He was probably sitting there thinking, for God's sake, do not post about me. Do not say anything about me. Just resist Facebook or Twitter. So there's also that kind of responsibility to think about when we're talking about social media and things like blasphemy. Ability of the state to spy. And this again links in with the present topic, which is, dissent. This is where the state can control dissent. There's a law out in 2013, I urge all of you to read it. Ministry of Law Pakistan now has a brilliant new website where you can access any and every law, including the Urdu translation. It's called the Investigation of Fair Trial Act 2013. What this law and don't fall for the catchy name. I mean, it's a bit inspired by the Americans, where Americans come up with really nice sounding names for brutal laws such as Patriot Act, you know, and the law is anything but patriotic. So what the Investigation of Fair Trial Act 2013 allows the state to do is that it allows 4 principal agencies, the MI, the ISI, the IB, and the police, to approach a High Court judge in chambers, in secret, without any notice to you, to tell them that this person, for example me, is involved in some kind of terrorist activity, and we need to hack into all kinds of electronic communications that he's ever done, from Facebook to email accounts to passwords to my bank transactions, and that High Court judge, without any notice to me, gets to decide whether they have that warrant or not. And then they take that warrant, and then they go and start. If they get that warrant, there are a number of checks and balances, but if they get that warrant, then they can do anything to you. And they can barge into your house, they can pick up your computer systems, and you can say, what are you doing, what are you here for? They're not under any obligation to tell you why they're doing that, right? And you do not have any information or way of knowing about how that data is being used. There is no obligation on them, and this is something that you should deeply hear about. There is no obligation on them to destroy your data after they've used it. Right? So they can keep your data for 50 years, and some 50 years later they could turn around, aha, in 2015 you once visited that website and you were looking at ISIS, you know, and I don't like you anymore, so come into our office and have a little chat. Okay. So that's the kind of thing that Investigation of Fair Trial Act allows you to do. And it also makes your internet service providers, makes it mandatory for your internet service providers to relay all data to the government under that warrant, right? And if your internet service provider does not do that, they will be fined 10 million rupees, so that's 1 crore. And I represented some telecom companies, so they're not going to care about your civil liberties. They're going to say, 10 million rupee fine versus somebody's civil liberties being violated. Yeah, somebody's civil liberties being violated. Yeah. Okay. So then there's also the role of corporations, Twitter and Google, which, you know, we should think about it, but I won't touch it here because I'm running out of time. I'll quickly talk about Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. This is something on which I blame the internet activists in Pakistan. They were after the government came. Cyberbullying was going and there was too much hate speech online, and you must bring out a law. And this is what the government has brought out. And if you need the latest version of the law, you can email me and I'll give you this latest version. It's a much more cut down version compared to what was initially floated, right? So the law does a number of things. The good news is that nobody can pose your head on somebody else's naked body. If they do that, that's a crime now. Okay. And then it covers other things like hacking and invasion and theft and misuse of private data. But what it punishes is glorification of an offense or a person accused or convicted of a crime. Right? So imagine if Lams actually had that talk on Balochistan a few weeks ago, and you had somebody over information system talking on Skype who was declared by the state as a terrorist, or as somebody who was accused of an offense, Lams would also be guilty under this new law. Okay, so glorifying anybody who is accused of an offense has now become a crime. And it defines the term critical infrastructure in a particular way and prevents you from interfering with it. And this is the definition of critical infrastructure. It means anything that is so vital to the state or other organs of the Constitution that its incapacitation disrupts or adversely affects the national security, economy, public order, supply services, health, safety, or anything else. And also gives them a blanket power that they can specify any other infrastructure which you can't interfere with. So you cannot have a WikiLeaks operation ever in Pakistan. The government could be spying on you, they could be communicating over how they want to violate your privacy. You could see that email, but you cannot send it to anybody. Okay, that's a crime under this new law. And if you do this with the intent of creating fear, panic, insecurity in the government, that's an interesting phrase, insecurity in the government, or the public or a section thereof, then you are liable for cyber terrorism. You can go to jail for 14 years, and you can be fined up to 50 million. Okay, so let's recap and conclude. Everybody likes speech, but ... comes in, I don't like speech when it does this. Ask yourself this question, how far are you willing to tolerate speech? my request to you as a citizen is tolerate speech as long as it is not immediately causing anybody physical harm. Dissent can flourish, but we need to be more proactive. We also need to be more strategic, right? Privacy is essential to dissent, so become more familiar with laws that threaten your privacy. Talk about it, write about it. That is what worries governments, okay? Don't give up on the legislature. I've said this before, I don't know if I said this here last time, that legislators do not exist to make laws. So if people tell you, look at what the parliament is doing with this draconian law, legislators do not exist to make laws. They exist to balance power in a society, right? And in this society, legislature isn't the biggest power. The Pakistani military is. So the civil-military imbalance is something that the legislature is trying to deal with. And if you criticize the legislature, then the legislature can go back to the military and say, look, my constituents are actually giving me a hard time about this law, I need to amend it more. And I need to make it better. So the legislature is your best bet of making Pakistan safer and more democratic. It's not, those people are not the villains here. Okay. The last thing I want you to consider is that Pakistan has a rule of law problem. It does not have a dissent-related problem, does not have a free speech problem, does not have suppression of anything else problem. It's a rule of law problem. It's a broken system where everybody from the state to the ordinary citizen can aid violence, can be part of it, or can simply stand by, and the state is too weak to do anything. Okay? So whatever solutions we design have to be addressed to the whole system, not just for, oh, let's solve the speech or the blasphemy problem. Right? And my personal theory is that everyone needs to be more strategic about how they're going about these things. And there's a reason that people in Pakistan throw in so many of buts when they're talking about free speech. And I think it happens in countries where you've seen so many dictatorships that when you see other people exercising their rights and them fighting for it, you say, what's their problem? It's not a big deal if they don't have those rights because you just can't relate to that kind of freedom. Okay? So that's my personal theory. That's the only bit of personal theory I'll bore you with. And yeah, I think everybody can be more strategic. If you need to reach me for this law, you can email me at wme@LLM12. And if there are no lawyers who ever want to work for me, God forbid, you can email me at the firm address. Okay? So thank you.
Okay. The next speaker is Majid Sheikh, who's been at Dawn, Pakistan Times, BBC, Birmingham Post, Guardian, Financial Times, and Lahore newspaper?
Lahore.
Yeah. For 40 years now?
44.
So he will have experienced all forms of censorship and seen it up close, so he can fill us in on his experience.
Thank you. I'll keep sitting. You heard a lot of theory, you heard the law, pretty scary. After listening to that, I will talk. You've heard all the other stuff. I'd like to concentrate in my brief, and I promise it will be brief, talk about myself and how, as a journalist, I actually lived out all these censorships. So I'll start from the beginning with this particular meeting. They kept ringing me. They say they kept ringing me. They say they kept sending me SMSs. They rang. Nobody rang. No email came through. I kept wondering what's going on here. Has Lums been silenced? What is going on, After the Balochistan thing, maybe somebody's trying not to get through to me. It really made me worried. It's got me worried. What's going on here? So that's the scary part. Now I'll begin from the beginning, as I said. My first confrontation with the state, because my father was a journalist and he was involved in an indirect way in the Rawalpindi conspiracy. He just left my English mother and all his children and went to England, ran away. About 30, 40 years ago, I had to run away, but for very different reasons. And the only funny part about my father leaving was that he asked his very dear friend, the painter Shakir Ali, कि ज़रा बच्चों पे नज़र रखना, and Shakir Sahib would walk to our gate and he would call out to the servant, "Tale pe ek glass pani," and he would drink the water and go away, So one day we just put the water on the gate, he had the water and went away. So this sort of built into all of us that even in adversity, we've got to keep our sense of humor going. We've got to fight. We're not going to be afraid. When I became a journalist because my father had died and there was not enough in the house, and I was in third year government college. And after 2 years on the desk, I learned that everything is censored. I was in the Pakistan Times desk, and then I became a reporter. And I remember my first press conference was with the IG police. I was telling a class the other day, and they were giving everybody envelopes full of money. And when my turn came, the IG said, "No, he's a different fish, absolutely." So I never got money from the police, So that was a form of censorship. And as I went along, I experienced these censorships in different forms. But as I went on and I became a bolder journalist, the state became more and more violent. I think it was 83, the Ganga hijacking case. Yes, it was, no, it was 7, I think Mr. Bhutto was in power, I remember. And I was at the airport and the photographers, and suddenly the government had some sort of a problem. They wanted pictures of the hijackers. And one ISI agent approached me and he said, "Can you take pictures?" I said, "Yes." Reporters are always looking for spaces to go for. They want a story. The most compulsive thing in life is that story. Your life doesn't matter, nothing matters. And ultimately he put me in a jeep and I went, and this man put a gun to my head and said, "You are a spy." I said, "No, I am a very poor reporter." I showed him my old, horrible looking ID card. I think Nazir also had one of them. And so I took pictures of him and I went in the aircraft and I got back. And when I got back, they arrested me. And these commandos beat me and put me in a chair and they took the camera away. And then they started having a discussion. I said, "Excuse me," said, "Shut up, otherwise we'll shoot you." So I said, "Okay." And then they were saying that Mr. Bhutto wants to see pictures of the hijackers. It will take 2 days to. I said, "I'm sorry," but again I was looking for that opening for the story, And I said, "We'll go to our Pakistan Times thing and we'll do it in 1 hour." And they went for it. So they put me and our photographer, Riaz Chaudhry, and we went there, and on the way I said to the photographer that you always put 2 pieces of paper. One you do for the army, the other you throw in the dustbin. So they left with 36 pictures with the promise that they'll give you one. I kept faking, and when they left, we suddenly developed the 36. I took them and ran away, hid at a place, wrote my story, gave it to the chief sub-editor. Next day, hijackers all over Pakistan Times, And 7 in the morning, ISI comes and picks me up, takes me away, and chains me to a chair in their office on Lawrence Road and puts a huge light into my eyes. Says, "Why did you put the pictures in the paper?" And I said, that famous debate, national security or public interest, I said, "My reader is more important." I thought. He said, "Do you know they were our men?" So as we went along, then ultimately, when I was a BBC correspondent, this very same agent who had taken me almost to my death in that hijacking kept warning me, "They're going to kill you today, they're going to hit you." And they were, every second week I think I was bashed up, still from lashing hair on my back. And then one day the Chief Marshal or Administrator called me and he says, I think we'll have to shoot your 2 daughters. I think you know my 2 daughters. By the way, they both went through lumps. So I had to leave the country. And when I arrived in England on a cold February night, nowhere to go, children crying, I realized there were over 50 Pakistani journalists who had run away and who actually never came back. Who were still there. But I said, I'm going back. No way. And I came back, and then again. So this has been going on. I've been enjoying your conversations immensely. I said I'd take a very personal view of all of that. The state hits where it pinches most. In my days, by the way, I'm not a computer geek at all. I'm from the hot lead age, as they call it. You know? So even when I joined Financial Times, they were still stuck in the hot lead age. So it was a bit shocking. But anyway, in our days, the press did hurt the state. So they hurt me. Nowadays, the internet hurts the state. So they kill. I've escaped death many times. I think I've been attacked 7 times. Thrice very, very deadly, absolutely. But I'm a very good runner. I know how to run away. You know? But the thing is, not to be afraid, to keep plugging on 44 years. In the end, 15 years ago, Don said, write about Lahore. So I write a weekly column called Harking Back, which is, I've got some books out on Lahore. And you'll be surprised, even when I write about Lahore, I'm hitting out at an indirect power, which is the trader class, who are destroying the walled city. And they've had 2 goes at me. A source of mine who lived in Delhi Gate was shot and killed. If you enter Delhi Gate even now, you will see his picture outside. Very fine gentleman. So power attacks those who hurt them through words. As he was saying, he doesn't agree with this assertion. But it is exercise, it's very brutal. Don't be afraid. Keep it up the fight. And I think our society today is a better one. I know we're facing bad times, blasphemy laws and all that, but we'll get out of it. So that was my personal touch. I think I'm a man from the lead age, but I'm pretty good at computers, rest assured. And I saved my daughters by running away. And as a very great Frenchman said, those who run away today live to fight another day. So I'm before you, and you can ask questions from anyone. And over to you.
All right, then, thank you for all the speakers. We'll open up the floor for questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, please stand up, say your name, and ask your question.
Let's have one question.
Yeah.
I have a question for Waqqas. You kept saying that you don't think there's a problem with the laws of Pakistan with regards to free speech, right? The issue is enforcement issues, abuse of law and rule of law generally. But don't you think there is a problem with the way certain laws, specifically the blasphemy laws and certain parts of the penal code are phrased in that they leave so much ambiguity that you could virtually justify any act of violence if we really get to the point where you would have a trial, most people just met out justice, as vigilantes. But if it were to get to trial, and when it does, don't you think there is a problem with the way those laws are written and with the way they are phrased, that they actually accommodate acts of violence just by virtue of being phrased the way they are?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry if I came across as saying there isn't a problem with the law at all. Like, I think there are serious problems. I think even the constitutional freedom is problematic because it imposes so many limitations. So I apologize if I came across like that. But my point was that the law isn't the problem, right? So the source of violence isn't law. Blasphemy law isn't the reason that a vigilant, madman, like Mumtaz Qadri, not madman, but a rational man, will kill another person in the name of religion. He wasn't killing him because there's a blasphemy law on the books. He gets that belief about blasphemy from somewhere else, but, because of societal attitudes towards religion. So that's the problem, right? And the point that I made when I said that a number of US states have similar laws, they also have those similar laws, Belgium and Poland as well. But I think our problem is that the law has been abused so often that that's where the problem comes in. So Asia Bibi's case is a classic example of the law being abused and a man speaking up for her and then being killed as well. Right? So if we have a legal system that worked, or if we could guard against abuse of the process of the law, then things would be far better, and then having the law might not have been such a bad thing. Right? But as you said, we do not often get to the legal stage because people are killed in advance, and other countries have similar laws, but they're not abusing it as we are. And I also think that, I mean, when we talk about solving the blasphemy law related problem, I think NGOs often say to the politicians, "Oh, repeal the blasphemy law." Right? I think it's fundamentally irresponsible for anybody in Pakistan to expect their legislator to vote against the blasphemy law. You can't go back to your people whose vote you ask for and say, "By the way, I repeal section 295C. Somebody's going to take a gun out and kill you right there. So what my personal opinion is, and I rarely do this, but I mean my personal opinion is you can stop the abuse of blasphemy law, which is everybody's major concern, by building in enough procedural checks into that law. Right? But don't ask any government or legislature to wipe that law off the statute book. You're asking them to be killed, and you're asking too much of a politician.
Okay.
So my question is addressed to the entire panel, but it's going to be addressed to the swanky planet Earth. So I spent a lot of time in my childhood reading philosophy, and what things that I took out of those things, other than debating whether unicorns exist or not, I regard there is no isomorphic relationship between ideas and language. And language is all we have. So what if I was to write, and so there are different interpretations to what people say. So what if I was to write an op-ed in a newspaper, and somebody was to infer something which I actually didn't mean? What's the legal position on that? This is my question. What's the legal position on that?
If you say something and they interpret it wrongly and then try to use it.
Most good writers write between lines. Okay, they don't just write straight criticism.
Yeah.
And if somebody was to misconstrue me or infer something which I didn't say, what's the legal position on that if that thing goes to court?
Well, if you're really bothered by the way they're interpreting you and they're sharing their opinion with one other person, then that could constitute defamation. Right? So if they misinterpret what you're saying, and as soon as they say it to one person, that's publication within the definition of the law. And if you feel that that does injustice to your reputation, then you could sue them for defamation.
Another question?
I want to ask you to panelists to talk about the Electronic Crimes Bill Act. So you described some of the infrastructure the state now has when it comes to electronic surveillance. So what's the end game with regards to that? I mean, I can't think of a state which has rolled back on its electronic surveillance infrastructure once it has it exposed to the public. So the state retains its right and even continues to expand on its surveillance activities. So where does the end game lie?
Initially when the Snowden revelations came and people found out that there were crazy amounts of surveillance happening, left, right, and center. Initially, the first reaction of a lot of activists and people in general was, say no to surveillance, and that sort of. But then, soon after that, people took a more rational approach. Whether you like it or not, surveillance will always happen. It will always be there. But what you can do is to ask for more procedures to be built into the structures that are used to surveil people. And by procedures, you also need legal procedures, technical procedures, public and judicial oversight onto things, and of course demanding justifications from the government, basically opening up more speech on the issue, which can probably lead to sort of more controls taking place on such a thing. So I talked about extra legal surveillance, and then we also talked about legal surveillance. And one thing that differentiates the two is that, you know, if surveillance takes place beyond the ambit of law or any form of oversight, then the question of even asking them to, you know, justify themselves is also is useless. But then if you try to, you know, pull all of what is happening into a legal sort of a framework, then it makes space for it to be, you know, questioned and improved upon and limited through various safeguards and checks. In terms of the softwares and the technologies that I talked about, we have ample evidence of how specific softwares like FinFisher were used against journalists and human rights activists, where people were deceived into, you know, so a lot of, for instance, an example of Bahrain, where FinFisher was actively used to basically deceive journalists into say, you receive an email from me, from my email address, saying that, you know, there's a protest or there's a meeting at so-and-so place, and so-and-so people will be there, except that it wasn't me who sent it to them, right? And that way people were deceived into getting to a place or sharing more information about their network or the work that they did, and they were persecuted based on that. So this is one example. There are several more examples of how this software has been used. And by pressurizing the companies that create these softwares, the governments that allow the export of these softwares and the governments that purchase these softwares, a lot can be sort of done to limit the harms that are taking place.
Yeah, actually, there was a question from Ali Nabil, and his HSS faculty, and he was asking that to what extent do you think that self-censorship is becoming a bigger problem than censorship itself?
Who is this
If
question?
anybody would like to.
Yes, I'll dwell on that. There has always been self-censorship. I remember even when we were working as journalists, even crime reporters and political reporters and covering the assemblies, a considerable amount of self-censorship has always existed, still does exist. It is really honed in by the environment and the circumstances, and most importantly by the organization for who you work, because that particular organization has its policy, as they say, and journalists learn to live within that policy. I would say that self-censorship is really a straitjacket in the sense that you impose upon yourself. That is where the difference between a good and a mediocre journalist comes out, where you manage to say what you want to say without ruffling too many feathers, and that's the skill, I think, that really distinguishes you from other people. Yes, self-censorship has always existed, still does exist, and in my opinion, or whatever it's worth, it will always exist.
Just would like to add to this the quantum and the impact of self-censorship. In my understanding, the censorship imposed by the government or by the market would be less damaging than the self-censorship, because the person who is imposing self-censorship on himself or herself is actually assuming that this shouldn't go, whereas he or she is actually compromising people's right to know. So the government imposed censorship or the market imposed censorship will be visible. People will understand that this thing has not been said because of the fact that government is forcing them not to say this, or the market is forcing them not to show these things. Nevertheless, the self-censorship is a kind of hidden thing, which people would not understand apparently, but it is something that is more damaging than the other kinds of censorship.
So if a blank space left on the front page is less damaging than replacing that story with something else?
That's more damaging. That's
a form of protest.
Self-censorship.
That's a form of protest also.
Yeah.
I remember when when they arrested Mr. Zajabuttu, the People's Party newspaper was Masawa, and their headline was Ab Makhiyan Maro, you know, and it was about an LMC sort of campaign about how dirty the city was, and now we'll all have to fill flies. What it was indirectly saying is that martial law has been imposed, and and that's it, you know, and there's nothing that can be done. There's censorship. Many newspapers, even I think Masawad in those days, used to carry blank things when they imposed a direct censorship. You couldn't send your story unless you submitted it to the military authorities. So many newspapers then used to carry empty spaces. Then the government passed a right, the newspapers cannot leave out empty spaces. It was quite hilarious in those days. I mean, if you left an empty space, you could be probably beaten up or something like that. It was quite silly in those days. But I think leaving an empty space is a form of protest. Journalists in Pakistan, I must say, are a very, very brave lot. Throughout their brief history, they have fought it out and they are on top. And I think that's a form of self-censorship, but you could also protest through that media, which they have very skillfully done.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The security situation in Pakistan is filled with such uncertainty and sensitivity, and then there is increasing vigilantism and intolerance. In such a situation, how does one go about expressing themselves and dealing with the situation? Another question I have is regarding the new anti-cybercrime bill, which is currently being worked on under in the parliament. How is that different to the existing laws which exist regarding cybercrime?
I think I'll take on the first part of your question. The second, I think he's more qualified. I think there's always going to be this debate between what is national security and what is in the public interest. This is what the question boils down to. It has to be handled with deft, I think, because the state is pretty brutal at even in the best of times, and it is for the journalist, for the proprietor, let's say, who feels that something is of national interest, is of more of public interest. So there's this balance between public interest and national security is an ever going on. The more debate you have in society, the more open your society is, the more public interest gets stronger. And this is a very interesting debate that is going on, and I think at the moment I do feel that the public interest is, I feel, on the up. No doubt about that. As far as cybercrime, he's the expert. I don't know much about that.
Well, there are a number of differences, and that requires a separate session of its own, but I'll just try and tell you two or three. So one is the thing that I talked about. It's now a crime in Pakistan, it will be if this law is passed, to glorify an offense or person accused of an offense, right? Or somebody convicted of a crime through an information system such as the internet or radio or television or whatever. So if, for example, you support the Baloch Liberation Army and you think that they're being targeted unnecessarily and you put something on Facebook and somebody in that is accused, so you could be punished, right? Classic example of this, and even, I mean, the US had a similar law in a famous case called Boulder versus Humanitarian Law Project, where America now made it a crime that you cannot give material support to terrorist organizations. So people in the US were giving advocacy trainings to the LTTE, which is a Sri Lankan organization. The US government told them you can't do it. And they said, we're not giving them money, we're telling them how to organize conferences and sell their message. And the government said, no, you can't. They made a First Amendment challenge. The Supreme Court said nothing doing. This is not going to happen. So cybercrime law also makes that material support also a crime, right? The other thing is that it does is it gives the PTA, the Pakistan Telecom Authority, unbridled power to block or limit access to any content on the internet. This has never happened before in any law. They earlier had the authority to snoop on us without using a warrant and the government telling them to. And जो YouTube block करने का है, they've done that through ad hoc measures, through notifications and so on and so forth. And those were challenged in court, right? That this isn't written down in any parliamentary law, this is an executive action. But now this is now written down in a parliamentary law, that they can block access to any material as long as it affects the glory of Islam, the security or integrity of Pakistan's friendly relations with foreign states. And then the punishments are a lot harsher. So we can talk about that in another session, and you can email me and I can send you a copy of the law. It's 13 pages and everybody should read it.
I think the YouTube sort of blocking thing is very interesting, because the judge who's dealing with that, Mr. Justice Mansoor Ali Shah, when you read the newspaper, you can feel that he desperately wants to remove the thing, and in private he's also said that. But the law sort of binds him down, with blasphemy and all these things. That particular reason why they block is only one film, a video, out of about 1 trillion. I don't see the point in blocking because of that silly thing. It is a silly thing because I've seen it. And the judge is desperate to get sort of rid of this man, but the laws don't allow.
Okay, the last question.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you were discussing the role of the legislature and with the anti-blasphemy, the blasphemy law, and also the cybercrime law, is there a potential, because you're saying it's hard to deal for the legislature to repeal it or deal with it, is there a way to deal with these laws, these types of laws, through the judiciary or through the courts instead? Is there a potential of bringing the constitutional law, interpret it in a way to actually repeal, maybe if this law passes, the anti-cyber law, or to change the blasphemy law, or even to remove it, or there's no such potential?
I think the cybercrime law is probably easier to challenge in courts using the Constitution. So this provision that the PTA can ban anything, without giving any notice or specifying anything or requiring public hearing, that kind of thing can be challenged more easily. So you can go to the High Court and file a petition. And a judge will probably give you that at some level. But when it comes to other things, for example, search and seizure powers of the military or the designated agency under the new law, they can also give you warrants and they can come in and search your things. That's where courts will be more reluctant, because judiciary is inherently conservative, and that's the problem I have with people who have a lot of faith in judicial activism. Judiciary never changes society. It only follows, what the majority of the people, or at least a critical bulk, are thinking, and there's great literature on that in the US as well. The other thing, blasphemy, no, I don't think you can expect any High Court justice to strike down the blasphemy law saying it violates free speech. In the mid-1980s, a High Court justice was killed because he held somebody on a blasphemy case not guilty, and he said this law is being abused. And the day he left the High Court, he was killed, like right on Mall Road. That's a documented incident. And that's not talked about enough. And now you've had the Salman Taseer and the Shahbaz Bhatti and Rashid Rahman incidents. So that message is not, and that's, I think, primarily because that violence comes from non-state actors, not from the state. I don't think the state and its intelligence agencies want to kill people for this reason. But no judge is going to judge that. And I think, at least that's my view, and I also, I've had this discussion with Furhan even in Manila as well. We were there for a conference. I don't think it's good strategy to bring the YouTube case to the High Court, because I think no judge is going to say open YouTube, right? That's really, really difficult. So what you really need to work on is public opinion, and work on your legislature to make it so difficult for the PTA to block something, like build in procedural provisions that it needs approval from X, Y, and Z. And blasphemy mein aamtaur pe ye hota hai, as soon as somebody is charged, there's a mob, and then there's violence. So I had advised the Awami National Party recently as their lawyer on some procedural amendments, and one amendment that I suggested to them is that you should make it impossible for a blasphemy-related case to be registered before a committee of the Advocate General's office, the top police officer in the province, and the local police chief meet, and they do not meet before 15 days. So you have that cooling off period, you know, in which, oh, police should book him and then they should charge him, and that's, so you take that person away, you have that cooling off period, and there are other things that you can play around with. But I don't think a court is going to strike down the blasphemy law. A number of countries have it. That was my point, that having the law is not the problem. America, Poland, Belgium, all those countries have managed to make those laws redundant. Like, nobody can invoke them because it's so tedious. It involves so many procedures, investigations. Nobody wants to use it. But that is despite the fact that a number of, you know, God-loving people in the deep south of the US would love it if they had a blasphemy law. And that's why they still have those laws, right? The state has not been able to wipe them off the books, but the state has made it so difficult for them to abuse those laws that they don't get mentioned. So I think that's our strategy, advisable strategy regarding blasphemy.
And I think the problem, as you said, that not with the law, it's basically the misunderstanding and misuse of the law, not by the state and by the government, by the society. In our country, laws are meant to control certain things or to provide certain things, and the state is responsible to do all these things. Nevertheless, what happens is that a law comes into force, and the people take course into action. People take the law into their hands. They feel that now blasphemy law is over there, and now we can take action in accordance with the blasphemy law, not the state. So that is the problem. So once we need to, once people get to know that this is not their right or their role to take law into their hands, it's the state's responsibility to bring law into action, then I think the situation would be much different.
Okay, then, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you to all the students.